Great job on the Thurgood Marshall Report, guys. That was really good. We're learning a lot about Baltimore's freedom fighters in American history. Next up is the Lily Carroll Jackson team, and I know they're ready.
Lily Carroll Jackson was born on May 25th, 1889.
And she grew up in West Baltimore.
And in 1908, she graduated from the Colored High and Training School. She worked as an elementary school teacher in a segregated school.
My grandmother, Lily May Carroll Jackson, was a dynamo.
She's as important as Rosa Parks or any of the other heroines that we think of.
And people gravitated to her because she was a leader.
She was behind the scenes for the nation, but very well known here in Baltimore and in Maryland.
Lily Jackson helped to change and give rise to the political life of Baltimore.
Without her, the successes that we know about, the Brown versus Board of Education, for example, simply doesn't happen.
I think she truly is the grandmother of the Civil Rights Movement.
We are American citizens all, regardless of our race. We are American citizens.
Lily Carroll Jackson believed in equality for all. She was a freedom fighter, one in a long line of Americans who challenged discrimination, segregation, and injustice.
Let's talk about segregation for a minute here. Baltimore was really different then. It was a segregated city. Now, does anybody remember what the definition of segregation was? Let's see, Ryan?
Segregation, that was when people weren't allowed to go to certain places because of the color of their skin.
Absolutely. Let's think for a second. What kind of places? Sharette?
Schools.
Nicole?
Buses.
Michaela?
Restaurants.
Tamari?
On the trains.
Octavia?
Stores.
Absolutely. Segregation was a very serious time in America's history. It took place right after the Civil War, during that period called Reconstruction, up until the mid-1960s. There were all kinds of laws in place, the Jim Crow laws, where whites were legally able to keep whites and African Americans separated.
Lily May Carroll grew up in a poor section of Baltimore during the era of segregation. Because of local customs and prejudice, blacks were forced to live in crowded, unsanitary alleyways. Disease was rampant, and Lily lost 3 siblings to typhoid fever in 1 week. After that, the Carroll family moved frequently within the black neighborhood and worked harder than ever to build a better life. Lily had a sense of purpose even at an early age, thanks to the constant guidance of her mother, Amanda.
Anything that could create income, Lily learned how to do. Their home became kind of a small delicatessen. They would help fold the laundry done for families that Amanda Bowen would wash for.
At 10 years old, Lily asked her mother if she could deliver the laundry. She had heard about the pretty buildings on Utah Place and wanted to see them for herself.
And as she got to Lanville Street, there in front of her was the Francis Scott Key Monument. And she rolled up that hill with her little wagon full of the laundry for this household, and she said the whites who were walking on the street kept looking at her as she held her head high.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So she maneuvered and got this wagon full of laundry to the top step of 1320 Utah Place.
Goodness gracious! What's wrong with you? What are you doing here?
I was here to deliver.
Colored people are supposed to use the back door. You know that. Who do you think you are?
I am Lily May Carroll, and I am somebody. And next time I come back to this house, I'll be able to use the front door anytime I want to. Because someday, I'm gonna own this house. Here's your laundry.
Even at that early age, Lily May Carroll was becoming a freedom fighter.
There was no barrier that she would not try to surmount in order to pursue her cause of racial justice.
That was her mission in life, to ensure fairness for all people, to ensure equal opportunities for all people.
Lily Carroll was proud of her roots. According to oral history, her mother was a descendant of an African chief who lived in America as a free man. And her father was a descendant of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
Amanda Bowen Carroll and Charles Henry Carroll were faithful people. Their sense of family values informed her, starting with faith, starting with family, the church, and connection to the community.
Lily and her family attended Sharp Street Church, a vibrant and enduring local institution founded with the help of Quakers.
Sharp Street was a rallying place because it was a solid foundation in the community.
After graduating from high school, Lily worked as a teacher. Then in 1909, she married Kiefer Albert Jackson, a touring motion picture exhibitor. They began traveling together, showing religious films in churches around the country.
Churches were pretty much segregated. And because blacks at that time could not go to see movies, except sit in colored areas, they showed uplifting kinds of films to black audiences, and that was their source of income.
During these trips, Lily honed skills in public speaking and business.
It was the first businesswoman I ever encountered in my life, but she was everywhere. She was selling the tickets, checking the money.
During this time, the couple's first 3 children were born: Virginia, Juanita, and Marion. Life on the road was difficult. Especially in the Deep South, Lily and Kiefer faced racism and the constant threat of violence.
This is a very, very perilous time period for blacks. They would have seen the really stark, horrific conditions in which most blacks were living in the United States, and it would have been different than their own experience coming from a place like Baltimore, in which there were more opportunities for advancement.
After 10 years on the road, the Jacksons settled in Baltimore. To earn income, Lily began buying properties.
Lily understood that investing in real estate in her community would enable her to have financial independence, in addition to being able to say, to do, to speak out on behalf of her people and not fear retribution in terms of loss of a job.
In 1919, just as Lily was beginning to find more time for community work, her whole life changed.
And as my grandmother relates it, she had stayed up all night walking the streets of Baltimore in such pain.
Lily was suffering from earaches. Eventually, she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where extensive surgery was performed to treat an infection of her skull bone. The hospital was a segregated facility at the time.
She was on the stretcher, and she remembers being in the basement because she was American of African descent, and she couldn't be at the same level where whites were. At that point, Dr. Crow did what he did, but he made an error and cut the main mastoid nerve to her face, which caused a whole shifting of her face and did a terrible disfigurement of her.
Lily Jackson was never bitter about what happened to her. She worked even harder with their church than before her operation.
Yes, Lily was very religious. She believed that God had a special purpose for her. She saw herself as God's soldier in the fight for civil rights.
She said, I promised God that if he would spare my life so I could rear my children, I would be his servant.
She taught herself how to speak again. She started singing again. She played the piano. She then told her daughters that you never let anything hold you back.
She focused at Sharp Street Memorial United Methodist Church, got onto the trustee board, helped to pay off the mortgage of the church, became the first female trustee, chairman of the trustee board that they had had.
In 1924, the Jacksons welcomed a son, Bowen. 3 years later, Virginia and Juanita graduated from high school. Unable to attend colleges in Maryland because they were black, Lily sent both daughters to integrated schools in Pennsylvania, where Juanita participated in early civil rights activities. As graduates, both women returned to Baltimore in 1931 during the Great Depression.
And so it was very painful for Lily and Juanita to see, particularly black youth, experience high unemployment and high poverty when they were jobs that they could get were not for the discrimination and segregation.
Lily insisted that her daughters use their education and talents to serve the community. Virginia and Juanita soon created the citywide Young People's Forum. Juanita emerged a natural leader and was elected president.
There was nothing like that in the nation that brought a literal who's who of progressive America to Baltimore to give speeches, to participate in debates, and educated a whole cadre of young activists.
Speakers, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, and civil rights attorney Charles Hamilton Houston, inspired forum members to fight discrimination with letter-writing campaigns and petitions. Then, two horrific events on Maryland's eastern shore served as a wake-up call for forum members, Baltimore, and the nation.
The lynching of Matthew Williams in 1931 was the first one that occurred in 20 years.
Matthew Williams was killed on the night of December 4th, 1931. It's been estimated that 500 people witnessed his lynching. And George Armwood was lynched on October 18th, 1933. He was taken by force, dragged from the jail in Princess Anne, dragged several blocks through the streets.
My father went to the Eastern Shore as a reporter for the Afro-American to cover the Armwood lynching. And the body was still there and was on fire. There were still embers and smoke coming up.
They hanged and then poured gasoline on the body and set it on fire. And it was right out there in the middle of the street with all these people standing around. It was a horrible sight.
Lynching was a message crime. It was meant to send a message to the community. It was average people who lived in the community who believed that these actions were sanctioned by their community. And frankly, that's what makes it so terrifying.
Lynching was a nationwide crisis. The NAACP had battled for decades against lynching through activism and legislation. In Baltimore, published Carl Murphy's Afro-American newspaper kept blacks informed. African Americans were not the only community outraged. A small group of courageous whites also took a stand against racial violence, including Margaret Carey, a lifelong Quaker.
She was a strong and courageous woman who lived the life of her beliefs, particularly in the 30s when she was supporting civil rights and other activities with Lily Carroll Jackson.
I'm not surprised that Margaret Carey became an ally of Lily Carroll Jackson. They were strong, determined women who did not let adversity stand in their way, and they fought discrimination, they fought convention, and they stood up for the causes they believed in.
Like Margaret Carey, other allies stood with Lily Jackson and her community in the Baltimore freedom struggle.
Well, there was Bernard Addis, Judge Eugene O'Dunn, Broadus Mitchell, H.L. Mencken, Asbury Smith, and Elizabeth Gilman, all of whom were active in one respect or the other in the struggle against racial discrimination during this period.
The citywide Young People's Forum began to take steps beyond letter campaigns and petitions.
There was a shift in the 1930s away from gradualism to more direct action. And so in some ways, Lily Jackson represented the more gradualist approach, and Juanita Jackson comes of age when there's more direct action in the form of picketing and boycotts and the like.
First, a boycott of local A&P stores eventually resulted in 38 black men being hired. Then, there was the Buy Where You Can Work picketing campaign on Pennsylvania Avenue, Black Baltimore's main shopping district.
The Buy Where You Can Work campaign, which began in Chicago, had as its principal objective obtaining employment for blacks in retail establishments that principally cater to the black community.
And this is before the pickets that Dr. King and others lead. And so Baltimore plays a pioneer role.
Lily and Juanita were working together to mobilize the Baltimore community. Local and national organizations noticed. After completing her master's degree, Juanita was hired by the NAACP to help organize membership campaigns, beginning with the Baltimore branch.
It was really the 1935 membership drive of the Baltimore branch that grew the membership from about 250 to 2,000. And soon after that, Lily Jackson was elected its president.
With Lily's influence, the organization grew into one of the largest NAACP branches in the country, with members from all walks of life, including ministers, politicians, educators, business people, and ordinary workers. Lilly organized committees that played to people's strengths and encouraged everyone to donate money or their time to the crusade.
My grandmother would go to churches. She had membership committees of the NAACP in every black church in the city of Baltimore.
In 1936, Lilly strengthened ties with the national NAACP by hosting its annual convention in Baltimore. She also spearheaded the branch's historic partnership with civil rights attorney Thurgood Marshall.
Thurgood Marshall and Lillie Mae Jackson were comrades in arms. They worked different parts of the activity. I mean, Thurgood Marshall was a lawyer. Lillie Jackson was an organizer and a fundraiser.
Lilly was building the Baltimore branch into a dedicated civil rights organization. With new vigor and commitment, the branch launched legal, legislative, and grassroots campaigns that would eventually dismantle segregation in Maryland and also serve as models throughout the U.S.
The first successes in litigation under Lillie Jackson were the teacher pay cases. Black teachers were paid significantly less than white teachers of comparable experience and credentials. These cases became the vehicle by which the NAACP greatly expanded its reach. It became the device that produced the network that ultimately led to the group of cases that we call Brown versus Board of Education.
Leading up to the historic Brown versus Board victory, Lilly battled discrimination in Baltimore, amassing important accomplishments over the years. By 1950, Lillie Jackson was being recognized for her work. She had grown the Baltimore branch into the second largest in the country and had led a prominent role in boosting Baltimore's black voter registration and was elected to NAACP National Board of Directors. And she had fulfilled a promise she had made to herself as a young girl when she purchased the house at 1320 Etah Place. Working nonstop, Lilly pressed local, state, and national officials for reforms that improved conditions for black in housing, healthcare, race relations, and hiring practices. Under her leadership, the branch won jobs for African Americans in private and public employment.
My grandmother fought for African American police officers, African American firefighters. She picked her battles. And, you know, they might have seemed like small battles, but if you put them all together, it was massive.
Dr. Jackson, the flyers are ready. I just brought them from the office.
Thank you, dear.
You're welcome.
A message from the front lines. Look what we've accomplished in our fight for freedom. Equal salaries for teachers and equality in public.
For 34 years, Lilly worked with her allies and the Baltimore NAACP to secure equal treatment for African Americans. Even into her twilight years, Lillie Jackson did not slow down. In 1969, she founded Freedom House, a neighborhood community organization. In 1970, she retired, but remained as active as possible.
My grandmother, Lillie Jackson, always believed that freedom, the fight for freedom, was a family requirement.
Lillie Jackson paved the way for people like her daughter, Juanita Jackson Mitchell, and the Mitchell family to do so much.
Juanita Jackson Mitchell would blaze her own trail in the freedom struggle. Following early successes as a young activist, such as directing the 1942 March to Annapolis, she married Clarence Mitchell Jr., raised a family, and graduated from law school. She became a pioneering civil rights attorney, working with the Baltimore NAACP to win court battles that ended legal segregation in public universities, swimming pools, beaches, and state parks. Juanita's husband, Clarence Mitchell Jr., took the fight to the halls of the U.S. Capitol. He was so influential, he became known as the 101st Senator.
Clarence Mitchell Jr. was a towering figure in civil rights history. He was the chief lobbyist for the NAACP in Washington, and he worked closely with Lyndon Johnson to enact a number of civil rights bills, voting rights bills, that really opened up the whole area of anti-discrimination.
Perrin Mitchell became Maryland's first African American elected to the U.S. Congress, and the Mitchell's sons and grandsons have been elected to serve Baltimore and Maryland in the same tradition. On July 5th, 1975, Lily Carroll Jackson passed away. In her will, she asked that her home honor Baltimore's freedom struggle.
She wanted her home to be a civil rights museum so that future generations would understand how things happened.
So when are we going to the museum?
Soon. When we get there, you'll see the very rooms that Lily Carroll Jackson conducted most of her work in. It's amazing how much has been included in this museum. You'll see her work and the work of her allies. Juanita Jackson Mitchell's included, Margaret Carey's there, and other freedom fighters. You'll see video clips, photographs, historic documents. There's even a letter written to Lily Carroll Jackson from Martin Luther King Jr. When you get to the museum today, you will see why Lily Carroll Jackson was an American hero.
Lily Jackson and Juanita Jackson showed that individuals could make a difference.
We have a responsibility to make this a better place for our children, that we owe it to them.
What she taught us was being forthright, honest, committed to doing your best, to being a good citizen, to serving others.
I hope when other people come to the museum, they will see heroines and heroes that can inspire them in whatever battles they feel they need to win.
This is the history of what it took to bring us this far. But we still have a way to go. We have to fight to maintain the progress that we've made. And we can't give up. We have to keep being freedom fighters.